Welcome to the Third Rail Pod. I am your host, Mason. We still do not have a tagline. We'll never have a tagline. You probably have noticed from the lack of a second voice that this is a solo pod for this week. Crippling back pain is fun, so it's a Wednesday, but we'll go ahead and just knock it out. Today on the docket, what we have is presidential campaign. We got some celebrity gossip, and we have some discussion on memes. I know the sort of topic that you've certainly come to expect from this podcast by now, but we'll go ahead and just start right in with the presidential race. Basically, an update on my views of it, an update on what my analysis is of the likelihood of winning, what it means for society, what it means for politics, yada, 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 all that deep stuff. And then we'll dive into the little saucier, little more sexy topics later down the road. So the long story short is, people have dropped out. Beto, I think, was probably the biggest name to drop out, but it has essentially become. My official stance is that this is still a one person race. Joe Biden essentially, I think, unless there is some scandal, I always put in the disclaimer, there can be a scandal like, Joe Biden is caught like, with a woman or something along those lines, something breaks out that like, he has investments in the Ukraine or something. But basically outside of like a real scandal, Joe Biden is going to be the nomination. But if we go by like what the numbers say, what the experts say, etc., it's a 3-2-4 person race depending on how you feel about Buttigieg. So it's Biden, obviously, it's Sanders, it's Warren, and Buttigieg has really surged in the polls and he has strong fundraising. So the sort of all the metrics that we use would indicate that he is at least a abnormally strong fourth candidate. Like there technically is, and we'll just dive right into Buttigieg then. I do see a path for Buttigieg to kind of finesse his way in there. And basically it's sort of, I don't want to get too caught up in the sort of I don't want to get too caught up in the sort of lane obsession that kind of the 2016 primaries did with Trump, where the whole idea was basically as the field narrows, great job of using words there, as the field narrows, the idea was that Trump, he's basically 20 to 30%, and candidate X would get all the mainstream support and then just win the election. Now, you can either argue that, like, one, that kind of line of thinking was just bullshit to begin with, and actually Trump was much more popular even in his genesis than we imagined, or you can argue that basically there, by the time that the field had properly narrowed, that Trump had basically had the election locked up just from a mathematical standpoint. Because even later in that election, you had Cruz, Trump, and Rubio. I believe they were the three. And Rubio is not a particularly strong establishment candidate. I mean, if you're a Republican and you're not white, that's basically not a great move. This to not be white and a Republican at the same time for a whole host of reasons. There's, interestingly enough, Cruz and Trump didn't really seem to, and that's what I think the people always slept on with that race was that the Cruz supporters, their second candidate, because Trump and the evangelical, I mean, there were the sort of like super traditional evangelicals, like make gay marriage illegal types that were with Cruz, but a lot of them are not necessarily who weren't necessarily super locked in on like gay marriage and abortion. A lot of that religious crowd actually had Trump as their preferred candidate because he was, the next most. If we're just saying like who's the most conservative candidate, Trump would be out there outside of a couple little interesting deviations with free trade and stuff, which I think tends to be overblown. But we'll just kind of shift this back to the Democrats here. So the Democrats, so Buttigieg, his path is basically like Biden falls off early, and he can cannibalize kind of the Biden vote, and then his advantage with like he can cannibalize both Biden's establishment. If Biden drops out, and then I think he would basically have to say like Buttigieg is my guy and go out and campaign for him. Then maybe, and it could be even like a backdoor dealing where Buttigieg agrees to make Biden his vice president kind of after the primary is settled in this theoretical scenario. But, Buttigieg with Biden support, if Biden drops out early, Buttigieg, with his strong fundraising, with his, taking in theory more voters than from Biden than Warren and Sanders do, becomes the candidate of choice, particularly like if with Iowa, Buttigieg pulls really strong. He's probably a slight favorite in Iowa, which is interesting. So when I say Iowa, basically, so Iowa and New Hampshire historically have been more important states than other states. And the idea is the states in the primaries that come first, even though they mathematically, Iowa and New Hampshire, do not represent a large mathematical value, but they do represent a large value as far as how a candidate is covered in the media. If you get blown out in Iowa, you're not going to get as much press attention, which means that you're not going to get as much name recognition, particularly if you weren't already like a super strong favorite. That can really snowball against you. Now, my whole feeling has always been that Iowa and New Hampshire are they're incredibly overrated. Like, the most obvious example is like Howard Dean. He kind of has a surprise run, and it's like, oh, he wins Iowa, but then, it falls apart after that, and people say it was the whole Yarg thing with Howard Dean. But honestly, if you really do the deep diving with that, his campaign was starting to fall about from like a fundraising standpoint, particularly, and also just like he was dropping in the polls before then. That was just kind of one of those things where like we as a society just used like the eye test, and we were like, oh, this happened, then this happened, and sort of like a false correlation thing. But to run it back, so like Iowa and New Hampshire, I would say are more important than what their sort of electoral like mathematics of their delegates is, but I do think that tends to be vastly overblown. Because if you look, most of the time the reality is like the race is pretty much decided most of the time in a primary before that happens. And then what we do is we tend to retroactively be like, oh, this candidate won Iowa and New Hampshire, or one or the other, then like, oh, they won the election. Well, they were going to win anyway, the polling and the fundraising and all those other sort of like basic fundamentals on how we predict elections. Actually, those were kind of already in their favor before the primary. So it's not so much the primary swung it as they kind of started a snowball effect for something that was kind of, if you're the favorite and you win Iowa and New Hampshire, then a lot of times it's going to snowball, then you're just going to roll for the rest of the election. So that's where Buttigieg becomes interesting, because Buttigieg is, I think, clearly, the fourth, like if you're looking at Vegas odds, Buttigieg is the fourth best odds. So he's like Warren, Sanders are about even. Biden's a little bit better than those two as far as like when you look at like gambling odds. And then Buttigieg is clearly kind of a step behind him, but then is clearly a step ahead as far as being a favorite in comparison to Andrew Yang or Tulsi Gabbard or Julian Castro. Someone who has successfully sort of gotten public attention, but the fundraising and the polling hasn't necessarily matched up public attention, that they are essentially mathematically eliminated. I think Kamala Harris is the other one that you could maybe argue has a tiny bit of the chance left because of her public recognition and her fundraising, which is still not as strong as, and we'll get to the fundraising in the moment as far as campaign fundraising, because one of the interesting things here is that like Biden's fundraising has actually kind of sucked, But Kamala Harris actually has essentially her campaign has raised about the same amount of money as Biden's has. So you could finagle your way into talking yourself into like, oh, Harris still has a chance. But if you look at the polls, it's like 3, 4, 5%. She's basically out of it. So we're gonna shift our attention back to like Biden, Buttigieg, Warren, and Sanders. So Buttigieg is a slight favorite in Iowa, and you could certainly see like, oh, can Buttigieg win the election? That'll be like the first headline you'll probably see the next day waking up after the Iowa thing. If he wins, will be, can Buttigieg win the election? It's sort of like in sports. No, it's kind of a trite point to compare like how politics is covered to how sports is covered, but there are a lot of, it's not even just like sort of the extremism, the debate shows and all that, but there are actually a lot of similarities in sort of the human stories and the idea of competition and egos and all that. But you wake up the next morning after a theoretical Buttigieg win, and it'll be like, can Buttigieg win the election? Similar to like, if after the Ravens beat the Patriots in the NFL a couple weeks ago, it's like, can the Ravens win the World Series? It's a big enough win, at least as far as the media is concerned, where they're like, oh, we have to take this team or this candidate seriously now. The Buttigieg winning Iowa is not nearly as big as a deal as the Ravens beating the Patriots, but that's the discussion for another time. We may talk about the NFL a tiny bit here at the end, but let's focus on the politics for now. So Buttigieg has strong fundraising. So I have the fundraising numbers pulled up on 538.com right now. And this is sort of the other interesting little wrinkle that I wanted to sort of throw in here. So Bernie Sanders' campaign has raised a total of $74 million. Warren is at $60 million. Buttigieg is at $51 million. Tom Steyer is at $49 million. And for those of you who are like, who's Tom Steyer? Tom Steyer is a billionaire. So you probably have already figured out from me saying that he has self-funded his campaign. And the rules on self-funding your campaign are kind of unclear because like technically, so if you dive into sort of the election bylaws, technically you cannot actually just self-fund your campaign. What you can legally do is if you're someone of wealth, you can basically give your campaign a loan that the campaign has to pay back from you. So then you have a massive advantage if you're someone who has a large personal wealth, because that you can basically sort of say like, okay, my campaign starts out with $50 million, and then you can use that to boost your name support right away. And then most of the time when this has happened historically, essentially what happens, and this is where I get into where it's kind of a loophole, is that the campaign basically has to declare it because they won't be able to pay it back. But unless you're Donald, who actually did not donate very much, if anything, to his campaign. But basically the campaign then, because it can't raise enough money to meet the contribution from the candidate, it basically declares bankruptcy, like the Federal Election Commission equivalent of declaring bankruptcy. And then it's just like, okay, so he really did basically self-fund most of his campaign because he couldn't raise enough money because they couldn't win. But so you do have an advantage with a large personal wealth where you can basically inject your campaign with like a lot of money, but you can't actually like just technically speaking, you can't actually just self-fund your entire campaign. That's something that happened, I believe, after the billionaire who ran against Clinton and Bush in the 90s, whose name Ross Perot. So after Perot did that, where his actually was like that, they changed the laws, so you have to basically, so that you can't do the Perot thing where like you're just spending like hundreds of millions of dollars and basically shoving yourself into legit candidacy without getting actual donations from the people, asterisk / trademark. So anyway, Steyer technically has $50 million, but we'll ignore him. Biden has 37, and then Kamala Harris has 36. And then you get into basically the candidates who are essentially mathematically eliminated if you look at polls, endorsements, etc. But so you may be thinking, well, interesting. Sanders and Warren, aren't they the ones that are fighting against billionaires? And this is sort of the hidden thing that no one's really talking about. So actually historically, like when we think of campaigns raising money, we kind of historically think of this as like, oh, the billionaires get a disproportional amount of influence over the common people. It's all corrupt. All this money stuff is corrupt. It's basically just a way for rich people to buy elections. And to be clear, none of this money includes super PACs, which is kind of its own sort of black box, but super PACs can basically only run ads. They can't. A super PAC cannot fund events. They can't. A super PAC actually is incredibly limited on what they can actually do. Not that what they can do is completely useless, but we'll kind of jump back in there. Now, granted, the 538 side, it's not at a point right now where actually like PACs are doing anything, but anyway, my point is like PACs are kind of their own different beast. So Sanders and Warren, both being the two candidates that we kind of view as like the anti-billionaire candidates, but if you look at their numbers, it's what they would call small donor numbers primarily. So what 538 defines as a smaller donor is someone who donates $200 or less. So that's an incredibly small donation in the grand scheme of things. So that's now granted, you can only personally donate up to, I believe it's like five, might be 10,000. Anyways, you can't, like, if you're a billionaire, you can't write a campaign a check for $1 million. It's got to be, I know it's either like right around 10,000 or under $10,000. I don't want to try to Google stuff while I'm talking. So the small donors is about 57% of Sanders' fundraising. Large donors is about 25%. And then what they call transfers, basically that means money that came. It gets a little more complicated, but as far as we're concerned in this current election cycle right now, transfers basically means money from the previous year's from a previous election, whether that was in Sanders' case, his 2016 presidential run, basically money that he didn't spend from that, or if we look at like Warren, who's also about 17% transfers, that would basically be sort of money left over from when she had run her Senate campaign previously. And then Warren's numbers are pretty much exactly the same: 50%, 3% small donors, 29% big donors, 17% transfers. So why am I talking about all this? Well, so those two have the most money flowing into their campaign, and it all comes from, again, those numbers do not necessarily mean they come from people with small incomes, but there is a strong enough correlation that we can generally assume so. All right, if you're the average Nebraskan making 30,000-40,000 a year, or like average California making $80,000-$90,000 a year, you're probably not donating more than $200 to a political campaign. So what that means is that when it comes to campaign financing, it actually, the smaller people actually more and more are actually a greater influence when it comes to money. The whole billionaires can buy elections thing has really not been true basically since the Federal Election Commission era of American politics, but is less true now than it's ever been. Now, the difference is because, again, if you're a billionaire, you can, rich people can write checks for $10,000. They can fund PACs, etc. They do still have a disproportionate voice, so I don't mean to say that, like, I have the same amount of influence that Bill Gates has, but that particular thing is largely overblown. Now, where they do have an advantage is, in the sort of structural things. The Republicans control all three levers of government, so they can tweak the rules, whether that be gerrymandering districts, the way the Electoral College is currently set heavily favors them, and we could go on and on, but I want to kind of rewind this back to the candidates here. So Sanders, Warren are the strongest, and that's where I'm like, Biden might not be as clear of a favorite as I made him out to be last time we talked about it, which I believe was episode 2. So my whole argument in episode 2 is like Sanders and Warren basically cannibalize each other. If Biden was going to lose, it'd have to be a 2 or 3 person race from the get go, like in 2016, where his gaffes, etc., basically push people away who don't have a candidate that they strongly favor. And then because he's like Trump, has a very low floor, where because a lot of people, are still very much like, oh yeah, Obama was a great presidency. My life was awesome in 2015, and my life sucks in 2019. That a lot of people are just like, oh, Biden was basically the vice president. Why wouldn't he be great at being the president? He was the next guy up. One of the interesting things about Biden is that I have yet to meet someone who's like, yeah, I'm voting for Joe Biden. And I feel like most people, and this is one of those plug into the original segment of the podcast, Twitter is not real life. So if you go on Twitter, you go on Facebook, you would think that Joe Biden is the least popular candidate in all of human history, despite the fact that he's pulling nationally, he has a fairly strong lead as far as his national polling numbers. So if you look at his national polling numbers, he's listed at what 538 calls a plus 12. Basically, what that means is he has 6% better than any other candidate in the national. Basically, the amount of votes that he is projected to get overall nationally. So essentially, he is not quite. This was my original argument, was that if you look at just these national polling numbers, Joe Biden is essentially a mortal lock. Okay, there are more people around the globe where if you pull them, and again, a lot of these polls don't necessarily distinguish between people who are going to vote and people who are not going to vote. But if you poll 100 people, 28 to 33% of them say that Biden versus like Sanders and Warren both tend to sit around 20 to 25. And then Buttigieg, it's like 10. I mean, so, and then, everyone else is essentially irrelevant. So with the national polling, that's really where and then the other big advantage is historically another indicator of being, the strongest candidate is how many endorsements that you have from other politicians. So 538 has an endorsement tracker, and then they value endorsements based on, who they consider a party elite, basically, a former president, a speaker of house, and then they have governors, etc. Basically, they track. So how they do it, they go 10 points is current and former presidents, current national party leaders. 8 points is governors. 6 points is senators. And then you get down. 1 point is basically like people who are essentially nationally irrelevant. But it's an incredibly efficient way of tracking, basically who the sort of puppet master, so to speak, want to be in charge. Now, this is not a perfect metric because some of this is they were endorsed, before they had become essentially an irrelevant candidate. So if you look at Harris, Kamala Harris has what 538 says, 89 points. So she's the second most supported candidate as far as party elites are concerned. But those are, a lot of them are older endorsements that will probably move to another candidate because Harris is essentially out of the race. And Biden has 140 points, by far the most. Warren has the next most at 60. So Biden and Warren have the most elite party support, which is another interesting thing, that Warren is pretty popular with her party versus Sanders is not. But Biden, he has the two out of the three. So when we are, and I say we, I'm not a professional, but when 538 and folks like them who predict elections pretty accurately are deciding who they think is going to win, the three main things they look at this early in the race are polling numbers, we kind of went over all that with like where Biden's really strong nationally, but the two first states don't really necessarily favor him. Iowa and New Hampshire are, um, states that just demographically do not favor him as much as like some of the states that'll happen later in the race, particularly states in the South, which is what I want to get into in another moment here. You have polling, you have endorsements, and then the third one is the fundraising, which I went over. And that's interesting because Joe Biden, someone we think of as like a super establishment, ho hum, sort of your center of left billionaire, is the one that's going to be like, yeah, I love this guy. He's actually really far behind as far as fundraising is concerned. If you're going to say like Biden's not, that's the one thing that maybe be like, okay, this is not as guaranteed as I previously thought. Now, my thought on the fundraising thing and why ultimately I still say this is, I think Biden has an 85 to 90% chance of winning if I'm just using like my non-scientific gut feeling about all this, is that Biden is, he has a big enough name that like once if he starts winning a couple of races here and there, like he'll get the money. Because he still has access to sort of the Obama fundraising apparatus, which is still the most successful raiser of money that in human history, basically for any reason. So I'm looking like red. It's the fundraising apparatus of Barack Obama that he created for his Senate campaigns, which then he carried over and expanded on for his two national presidential campaigns, is the most successful money raising organization in human history. And Joe Biden will have access to that once, if he looks like he's going to win, because then Obama will probably back his guy. More of that organization of people will kind of get behind him. Basically, unless he really fucks up here, that fundraising is going to catch up because of that Obama fundraising apparatus that he has in his back pocket that I haven't really heard anyone talk about. But ultimately, Obama is sort of the black sheep in all this, or not this black sheep, the white whale. I think we can cut that out. The Obama is sort of the white whale in all this because, first of all, his voice matters, and we can say his. People on the left like to pretend that like, oh, Obama's a fucking war criminal, and basically we've moved on from him. But ultimately, Obama's voice still matters more in politics than anyone else's voice. It's just that he doesn't really use it, and we can get into discussions about whether he should be using it more or not, or whether he should just basically hang his head in shame and we can kick him out the door. But ultimately, Obama's voice still matters because he is the Martin Luther King Jr. of our generation. He is the biggest civil rights icon in our generation. That's just the reality of it. People who are Sanders and Warren supporters don't have to like it, but that's the way it is. And if Obama comes out and says, I support Joe Biden's going to get a lot more money, and Joe Biden is going to get a lot of more mainstream Democrat support, particularly with the African American community and the Latino community. Now, an interesting theoretical in my brain that, of course, I don't think will ever happen, this is more me just spitballing for fun here, is wouldn't it be funny and kind of interesting if Obama came out tomorrow and was like, I support Sanders or I support Warren, because that's kind of an anti-Obama move. Now, I don't think he would ever do that. I think Obama's made it pretty clear that at this point he's just going to set it out and then get behind who wins the primary. He's not really going to dive into this. Everything Obama has done since leaving office has indicated that he's not really interested in getting into the mix. Other than, kind of the bare minimum that other former presidents have done. He's kind of taken the same path and, all right, whatever. But it would be interesting if Obama kind of left in now, because I think his voice, he's such a white whale as far as just like the power that he has as far as just influence and then sort of the money that would come with his endorsement, that he could basically pick who wins this election if he wanted to, because it's, mathematically speaking, at least, I think close enough. So Biden's probably going to win. I think it's interesting that Warren and Sanders have kind of hung around. They've both hung around, which is really interesting because you would think that Warren and Sanders are sort of they're sort of the same. Like, so you'd think that, like, basically through the natural evolution of things, that like one of them would just, it's interesting that one of them didn't just drop out or become electorally irrelevant. They each seem to have carved out pretty interesting specific niches for themselves. So Sanders' has niche is kind of, to be frank, less racially or sexually intersectional. It's a lot of young college educated white people. Um, Sanders seems to still have a lot of support from people on the from 2016, and then he also seems to have the majority of support from people who are on the super far left of things. The thing about Warren and what kind of distinguishes them is that Sanders historically was not a Democrat. Okay, he ran all of his Senate campaigns until very recently as an independent and kind of snuck into the Democrat Party later, and then he was like, well, this is the only viable way to become president, so I guess I'll run. And I didn't think he probably wouldn't have even came back if his 2016 campaign, despite the fact that he ultimately lost against Clinton, was certainly sort of the Sanders 16 campaign was the zeitgeist of like, oh, basically everyone under 40 was like, oh, this is what this party's been missing the whole time. All right, this is actually what we want to see happen. And like Medicare for all has come from like basically like a pipe dream, although people still give like Obama too much shit for what essentially became Obamacare, because the original sort of the version of Obamacare they tried to get through Congress had what they called the public option. The public option is essentially the version of like basically what most other developed nations have, where you can either opt into the government's health plan or you can still pick a private health plan. So his is going to be similar to like a lot of these other places, like Canada essentially has that same system where they have a public option. The UK does. Sweden technically does, but like pretty much everyone's on the public option, and then they have like supplementary plans that you can get in Sweden and other. That's pretty much how all the Nordic countries do it, where you can get kind of like supplementary plans if you're sort of an at-risk individual, kind of similar to how like more or less how old people are here, people over 60 who are on Medicare. Like the Nordic countries basically treat everyone like they're on what we have now as Medicare. The public option was essentially going to be similar to what most other developed nations have. So it's like, well, Obama's plan did want to do that, but it became sort of electorally I shouldn't say electorally because he got in on that, but like basically he couldn't get the votes for it because of the filibuster, and so he had to make a choice. And basically, guys like former U.S. Senator Nelson and Joe Lieberman, our dear friend, basically like, no, we will not vote on this if it has a public option. You have to take it out and replace it with the mandate, basically that you have to have health insurance or you get fined in this country. And the idea of that is basically you're forcing young, healthy people to subsidize the private health industry so that they can keep costs low and still make money hand over fist. So that is the whole story about Obamacare. And I kind of got sidetracked there, but I wanted to mention that. But Sanders' plan is basically become mainstream. And, Sanders' plan is basically kind of actually even on like people, Sanders reporters will always say that like, well, Sanders is not a radical. He would be a mainstream or center of right politician in every country. I don't think that's necessarily true. Sanders' plan is to actually basically make private health companies illegal to some degree. Versus, like I said, most other countries, they do have a health plan, but it's kind of more in the original sort of Obamacare vein versus and that's kind of what other candidates have done, like Cory Booker, Kamala Harris. Biden really hasn't come out with a health plan, but it's kind of just assumed that he would probably just push for something that's maybe a little bit more left of center than like the original Obamacare, but more or less in that same vein. And then, but basically, most of the other candidates say like, well, we just kind of want to build on what Obamacare did versus like Sanders and Warren to a lesser degree have been like, no, we kind of just want to start over and do something that would either significantly reduce or outright eliminate private insurance. Where was I getting at with that? Yeah, so Sanders is kind of more like the radical, at least, sort of as far as the, I don't want to say aesthetics, but reputation. So Sanders is the more like real radical, like started from the bottom, now we hear it, versus like Warren comes from a wealthy family. Warren is the richest, as interestingly, the most personal wealth out of any of the candidates outside of like Tom Steyer, who is not a real candidate, but like out of the real candidates, she has by far the most personal wealth. Comes from a background of like helping do regulations with, well, like she has a lot more of a working relationship with the wealthy, and also her base of support is more intersectional. Not that Sanders doesn't have, you know, minorities and women who support him. I mean, Ilhan Omar and Alexandria Ocasio Cortez, the two biggest minority voices right now in U.S. politics, just came in support of him. So certainly Sanders has some support like that, but if you just look at the demographics and be like, X percentage of white people support Blake, X percentage of black support blank. All right, Sanders' base of support leans heavily more toward, and that's really where the split is, more so than racial, is like Warren is much more popular with women and Sanders is much more popular with men. And then Warren is a little bit more friendlier to the idea of like, you know, working with the, let's just call them capital class for lack of a more nuanced term, whereas Sanders is like, these people are the enemy. And so it's interesting that like that is really kind of split the far left Democrat base almost kind of down the middle. And then you see sort of a similar thing with Biden and Buttigieg, where Buttigieg is definitely like, he is a military veteran. You know, even though he's gay, comes from kind of like a ho-town, middle class, sort of meat and potatoes, salt of the earth kind. And you can get in the whole like, well, actually he, you know, comes from a pretty wealthy family, but like that is his image and that is the way he carries himself, as sort of a middle of the road, salt of the earth, meat and potatoes kind of guy. I feel like, you know, despite being gay, interestingly enough, I think Buttigieg is oftentimes seen as sort of a man's man, for lack of a better term. And then Biden is sort of just kind of centrist, similar like policy positions in a sort of centrist way. He has a lot more skeletons in his closet than Buttigieg has. Buttigieg really only has, you know, having just been the mayor of South Bend, doesn't necessarily have a lot of, you know, national travesties to dig up per se. But he does have some stuff. I think if he, you know, as he gets more popular, we'll see more of that stuff happen where like they had started digging into the closet as far as basically what a disaster the police force of South Bend had been as when he was a mayor. But that would be his only real skeleton that I know about. You know, if I keep digging into Buttigieg, I'm sure if I'm more part of the problem with running in politics in the 21st century is just like, you know, we just won't forgive anyone for anything bad they say. You know, they Bernie Sanders on Twitter a couple months ago was canceled because he used the N-word, you know, in person and in writing. And the context he used, now it's extremely important to consider the context of things. That's where this sort of thing has been lost. So Sanders was basically putting words into the mouth of like the way Republicans view black people in the 80s. And he's like, these black people, he's like, the way these, basically what he was saying is he was like, the way these Republicans think, these neighbors, and he used the real word, these neighbors don't deserve anything. And then he used that multiple times in that piece of writing, and I believe once in Word, when describing the mentality of basically Republican racists. And then all these, you know, black, you know, I think DeRay came out and a lot of other people would be like, that's unacceptable and this is disqualifying. Well, was it really disqualifying or did you just not like him to begin with? All right. Like, we can say, like, he probably shouldn't have done that, but at the same time, we can't fucking equate him using that word within the context of describing what racist people say and compare that to basically how, like, Steve King celebrates his Sunday morning after church. Steve King referring to the politician, not the author. Or Steve Miller. We'll use that since everyone knows who I'm talking about, Steve Miller. We can't use that, like, we can't compare Sanders using it in the context of explaining what racist people do and compare it to basically like Steve Miller's diary. All right. But so my point is, like, even like Sanders supporters will a lot of times be like, well, he doesn't have any skeletons in his closet, that's why he's the best guy. Well, no, he does. It's just a lot of these okay, but we're all imperfect and we've made bad decisions, and they've all got plenty of skeletons in their closet, and we're just gonna have to learn to deal with that, and ignore everything but the word. Look at what they voted for the most part, and I think, interestingly enough, for the most part, we've kind of done that with Biden. No one other than like Vox has really talked about the Hunter Biden thing. Plug to the next point, but yeah, like, we'll just have to learn to deal with it. So Sanders, Warren, Buttigieg, Biden. Warren is kind of bizarro. Sanders and Buttigieg is kind of bizarro Biden, and you have clearly two wings of the party. And then the other interesting thing, the last thing I wanted to touch on as far as the election is concerned, is I think people tend to focus too much on like what the actual policy and what the ideology is when it comes to predicting the election. Okay, like, so I'm not saying like media should stop covering health plans and stuff. I'm saying that, like, for people who like are wanting to be Twitter pundits or whatever, they actually tend to focus way too much on ideology, and people who are like, oh, Sanders is going to win this thing. Well, obviously Warren will drop out, and then Sanders will get all her votes. Yeah, then when Buttigieg drops out, like, somehow Biden's not going to get all of Buttigieg's votes. But actually, if you look at, like, so one of the other interesting thing about this election is that when you look at polls, and there's granted not a ton of these because it's not really a popular question to ask. But if you look at polls where it's like, who's your first favorite candidate and then who is your second favorite candidate? Despite all that stuff I said, actually, Sanders and Joe Biden have the biggest crossover. Biden supporters tend to be split actually about 50-50, slightly pro Sanders, as far as like who would be their second favorite candidate. And then the other even more interesting thing is Sanders, mathematically speaking, the majority of his voters have Biden as their basically second most preferred candidate. And basically what it boils down to is like, it's demographics. People, at the end of the day, to roll this back into the original sort of almost genesis point of this podcast, Twitter is not real life, okay? Like, when you see discussions had on Twitter or on Facebook about, whose health plan is the best, that's not really what people are considering when they go to the polls, okay? Like, as much as like Americans are kind of politically disengaged when you look at like their turnout numbers and stuff, ultimately most people are not sitting down checking the policy list and you're like, okay, I'm going to vote for someone based on this. I know I certainly haven't necessarily done that, but I probably, I'm doing a podcast about presidential elections, so I'm certainly more informed than the average voter. What they're looking at is they're doing a gut feeling, and science says that basically evolution has taught us, trust the people who are like us, distrust the people who are not like us. That's why racism exists. That's why sexism exists. That's why Bernie Sanders' support is disproportionately white and male. That is why Bernie Sanders supporters tend to go toward Biden, who is demographically the next most similar candidate. That is why Warren and Sanders have a lot less crossover as far as candidacy than you would necessarily expect if you look at their policies, which are much closer aligned. All right. While certainly policy does matter, because that's usually how people are going to decide whether they're a Democrat or policy matters in the sense that that is the discussions that we have. All right, we're not. No one's out there going to publicly admit that they just voted for the other old white guy or voted for. Might get a little more of that with like Elizabeth Warren. It's like, well, I voted for her because she's a woman, but you're not going to have a ton of people who will just openly admit, like, yeah, I voted for Warren because I wanted to vote for a woman and I'm a woman. But the interesting thing about democracy is that democracy, ultimately, the central conceit, the reason that we created democracy is we are like, okay, I think every single person thinks that the world would be best off if I were in charge of everything. So the conceit of democracy is that we are admitting basically that, like, yes, everyone thinks that they should be in charge of the world. And so they're going to vote for the candidate who's most like them. In theory, that is supposed to be the candidate whose views line up most with them, which is kind of its own interesting thing because, you know, historically it's been more demographic, and it kind of recently it has become something where it's the views certainly are not as important necessarily as like we all would like to think that people's worldview, like people would like to think that the worldview is the most important thing with these candidates, and that's probably not actually the case. It largely still boils down to name recognition, whether that demographic or that sort of image of a person, the image that person projects resonates with enough people. That's why white males historically have always been the best candidates, because until the 1920s, only white males could vote. Realistically, black people and minorities couldn't vote until the 70s, though they technically could. Jim Crow laws, etc. Basically, prior to like 1970, most black people could not safely vote at a poll. And the legacy of that is that white males are still the strongest demographic. Like, proportionately, there will be more white males that vote on this election than any other demographic. And then doubly true for like minorities, Latinos, their per capita poller turnout is pretty pitiful, just mathematically speaking. Like, the only demographic in America who favors Republicans over Democrats is white males, and yet Republicans just won their last two election cycles. Republicans just won every single level of government. They won all the courts, which is an extension of winning presidential campaigns basically at the right time. You can get in the technicalities about Merrick Garland, but whatever. You know, they won the presidency. They control everything except for the House of Representatives, and they have more governorships. 2018, people say like, well, no, Democrats won in 2018, but ultimately Republicans are still in charge of every lever of power in the U.S. government. They just caught up from basically getting their fucking asses kicked to like getting their asses kicked less hard. So white males ultimately remain, you know, kind of the top. And I know this is a real controversial opinion. White males still remain the most powerful demographic in America. America is a racist, sexist shithole. And yeah, that's my election thoughts, basically. Well, actually, kind of while we're on politics, then I did want to dive in while I brought up the other side. I did want to do a brief thing on the Trump impeachment, not the impeachment itself, which probably won't happen, but the impeachment investigation over, I guess the Ukraine scandal is the main thing, because somehow the fact that Trump just took money out of his campaign for himself didn't, or no, what it was is I misspoke there. It's actually much worse. He took money out of his charity and just put it into his campaign, and everyone was like, like even left people just didn't really react. It's like, yeah, we know this guy is a piece of shit. Like, you know it too. Okay, boomer. Plug to the next thing. But so we have this obsession now. Everyone's talking like quid pro quo, quid pro quo, quid pro quo. Say that 5 times fast. It's real fun. So everyone's talking about quid pro quo. It's kind of become the media term. It's sort of the sexy media term, quid pro quo. What is quid pro quo? Let's try that again. What does quid pro quo mean, Mason? Good question. Because the thing is, all over Twitter, all over Facebook, all over the social media platforms, you just see the average person talking about quid pro quo, and basically none of them actually know what it means. So it's really funny now that people they want to sound intelligent, so now they're just using this quid pro quo. How about this? Just call it corruption, or just call it like promise a deal. We can use regular people words in the media, guys. Okay, quid pro quo is not like some magic superstition. So I already kind of alluded to what it means, but basically what quid pro quo means in the legal context is basically tit for tat. I will give you this thing in exchange for another thing, and that promise has to be somehow illegal. So that is kind of the devil is in the details. You can say it's technicality, but all law is nothing but technicalities. So quid pro quo in the United States law, I've got the Wikipedia. I looked at some other pages. I'm not just reading Wikipedia, boys. A lot of research going up here on the Third Rail Pod, but I don't want to make this like a legal podcast from a non-lawyer. So let's just stick with the Wikipedia thing for now. So quid pro quo, basically in the United States, has largely, by far the most prevalent sort of use of quid pro quo in U.S. law is when it comes to sexual harassment. When looking at sexual harassment, they basically either look at like unwelcome sexual conduct, where basically it's like boss X is like, hey, let's have sex, if it's a term of employment. So basically a individual is hired on the condition that you have sex with the boss, or an intangible employment action. So basically that someone in their workforce is punished, not necessarily fired. They could be demoted. They could be passed up for a higher position because they won't positively enforce unwanted sexual advance. This is why in the workforce it is frowned upon, correctly so, for people in higher positions to basically have any sort of flirtation with people in lower positions. Okay, it doesn't matter that even if it's entirely consensual, it is morally wrong because it is a disproportionate power dynamic that is unhealthy for really any relationship, but particularly a sexual relationship. So that is the traditional use of quid pro quo in U.S. law. Now, some of you may be wondering, well, what the hell does that have to do with Donald Trump trying to get the Ukraine to dig up dirt on Hunter Biden? Congratulations, you're smarter than the media, because the media is taken off with this term, which technically does apply here, but like he either asked them to do something or he didn't. And ultimately, there's a couple of things here. One is him asking them to do it. Quid pro quo is basically the wrong thing to discuss, because if Trump asked the Ukraine to help his presidential campaign, even if it wasn't in return for something, then that is still illegal. That is a federal election commission. That's an election campaign finance laws. You just broke like every single election campaign finance law, and you can go to jail for, if you're a regular person, then you're going to go to jail for several years for that. But because we live in a fucking shithole, apparently the transcript of him asking for it is not enough to land him in prison. Like, that is in and of itself a president asking for that information is illegal. It's illegal for the same reason that asking Putin to dig up dirt on national TV is, according to the majority of legal scholars in this area, that act itself was illegal. The reason that all this quid pro quo discussion is so fucking infuriating is because it doesn't matter whether he promised them anything or not. He might have just said, do it for a favor because I'm your bud. Okay, that's still fucking illegal. He asked them to do it. It's illegal. That should be the end of the discussion. but because the media has to come up, and it's this fucking thing where I think it actually started with like Ben Shapiro, a fucking midget clown who should never be taken seriously. And he's like, nope, not a crime, not quid pro quo. It's sort of like not the collusion thing. You don't have to be working together for it to be a fucking crime. But because the media, one, because it's largely controlled by corporate interests who, this is the discussion no one wants to have, is that, even the New York Times, the Washington Post, all these sort of media outlets that are, sort of the respected sort of media constructs, they're owned by billionaires who almost unanimously support Donald Trump. Okay? So don't trust the media. Don't trust the media. Don't know how many times I have to say this. Should not trust the corporate media. But, they have to create this scenario where, it can be sort of a two sides thing. And then the scenario that these fuckers create is also wrong because he did do quid pro quo. He said, and I will help you massacre these fucking Kurds. We saw what he did. We know. We knew. Like, what? Do we need... Like, how much more evidence do we... Because here's the thing. Everyone knows he's a piece of shit. We know he's a racist. We know he's a sexist. We know he's a moron. We know he's corrupt. We know he's basically the physical... Like, everyone in the... And journalists tend to be... The majority of journalists tend to be left of center. This is why the morons at Fox News justify their existence. They're like, the media is full of leftists. That is because they are college educated and not fucking morons. They tend to be Democrats because if you're a Republican, you're a fucking moron for thinking global warming isn't real. Okay, so because they went to college and learned that I don't know, the earth wasn't literally created in 7 days. They decided maybe I shouldn't vote for these people who just live in a fucking candy land. But to roll this back, all these people, even in this construct created by the media to create a false equivalency, fails under the most basic ass fucking scrutiny because we can see what he did that was in favor to the Ukrainian government, taking away their aid and being like, we'll give this back as soon as you do this for us. Like, we know they took away the aid. This is a fact, and we know that he asked them to investigate Hunter Biden. Even in this construct that shouldn't exist, this false quid pro quo construct, again, we know. The thing is, like, we can't just pretend that we have to keep pretending that, like, 40% of the country is somehow like salvageable as like human beings. But ultimately, like, if you vote, this is almost sort of counterintuitive to the Ellen discussion from a couple episodes ago. But guess what? If you vote Republican, you're a piece of shit person. That doesn't necessarily, like, it is still true that the morally correct thing to do is to just refuse to speak to any single person who votes Republican. Like, I was saying, like, don't smash on Ellen for it because I think a lot of you people are being hypocritical. But, and, I don't like hypocrisy. And I think a lot of you still do that in your day-to-day lives. But, okay, like Mark Ruffalo can, not to basically put this whole thing back on trial, but Mark Ruffalo dunking on Ellen on Twitter, meanwhile, he's still willing to work for all these corporate entities that make his movies, the vast majority of whom have voted Republican and donated to Donald Trump. It's like, yeah, well, he's like, well, like, you're rich. You can exclusively be in indie movies for the rest of your life, dude. And you live in Hollywood, okay? Like, you're in the one industry where if you really wanted to, you could never speak with a Trump supporter again because you live in California. But guess what? You don't. It's just that, like, you're not doing it at a football game with a former president, and therefore you think you are immune to these consequences because you're lower on the totem pole than Ellen. Now, let's roll this back for a moment. That said, yes, it actually is a moral failing every single time that you say hello to a conservative. It's a moral failing. Every single time you see, like, a MAGA hat, you should just, like, physically assault the person. Now, I get that that is not practical because then you'll go to jail. But my point is, like, they're far beyond fucking gone. Like, we as a society just have to agree, like, just let them fucking die of cholera in the shit mountain that they've created. They're drowning in their own fucking feces. Just let these shithole states like Alabama and Mississippi just collapse under the weight of their own self-induced opioid crises, and then, you know, hope maybe their kids can be partially persuaded not to be complete fucking sociopaths. Just, we as a media just have to move on and pretend these people don't exist, but we don't. We keep making these false equivalencies because we don't want to believe that like 70 to 80% of Americans are wastes of space. I include myself in that. I couldn't parallel park a car the other day. I gave up and just drove off and find another parking spot. So I would certainly include myself in the majority of Americans who are an utter waste of oxygen. But at some point, we just have to admit that, like, at the very fucking least, can we admit that, like, the MAGA hat people that are wearing the hats should be banned? Can we at least just treat it like it's a Nazi? Like, just, we are not going to allow. Can we just, like, start putting like basically FCC style blurs over the MAGA hats and be like, this is a symbol of profanity? Can we at least do that? That's all I'm asking for. Okay, my standards are so low from you, the corporate media, that all I'm asking for is that we treat Donald fucking Trump, the dumbest person on the entire Eastern Seaboard, other than maybe like Devin Nunes, who's his own special class of idiot. All I'm asking for is that we just treat them like what they are, which is Nazis. Not just like, I will give CNN some level of respect for, like, they've CNN in particular has actually done a pretty decent job of, like, basically, like, no, actually this Trump said this false statement, kind of sticking that in the headline, but ultimately they still take a neutral approach to the fact that he has murdered Hispanic children. Locking someone up and not feeding them is an act of murder, by the way. And yeah, that's my thoughts on the Trump impeachment thing. Let's move on. So, okay, Boomer is a meme, and it sort of love it. I love it when everything ties together. I could tie all my talks to the election with, let's look at what's happening on the other side. We've got the impeachment thing. I said, all these Republicans are sociopaths, and we need to, you know, the morally correct position is to cut them out of their lives. That is essentially what OK Boomer is a declaration of. It's beautiful and everything ties in together. So OK Boomer is one of the more interesting things that has happened, and it is sort of a Twitter's not real life thing, certainly. Like, old people don't really know this is a thing, other than, like, the guy who's in charge of the AARP saying, like, fuck you guys, we have all the money. But for the most part, like, old people, like, if I go up to my father, who is pretty with it for a 60-year-old man, and I'm like, hey, Dad, have you heard of the OK Boomer thing? I will say with almost near certainty, he'll be, well, what are you talking about? So it is sort of something, but, like, clearly, like, normal 25-year-olds are at least familiar with it as a meme format. It has penetrated at least mainstream online culture. And the idea is, it's sort of an idea that's morphed. So the origin of the OK Boomer meme is basically some old guy on Twitter is, like, saying something, ignorant. I think it was like something about, like, student loan forgiveness. He was like, well, I paid off my student loans, ignoring the fact that his student loans are like $3,000 and most of millennial student loans are like $20,000 to $30,000 plus, and they accumulated interest for 4 years while they were in school. So it's just like I don't think it was even someone famous. He was like, okay, Boomer. And then it became a meme kind of basically it's the same origin as like the feral hogs meme that we also had a little bit of a discussion about on the podcast. It wasn't like a deep dive of what I'm about to do. So to me, it's interesting. One, because I think it doesn't necessarily start off. I'm not going to say it wasn't a meme to start off with, but I think it was more than a meme to start off with. Like, it's sort of a declaration of kind of a lot of things I just said about the Trump thing, where it's like we've spent who knows how many years. You know, you can say that you've been saying it since the Bush administration, but I think let's just say we've been saying it since the Trump administration. Like, look at what this monster's doing. He's kicking people out of here who came here legally, like the DACA recipients. These corporations are basically using Trump's immigration policy as a weapon to underpay his employers, then kick them out of the country if they act up. And they're putting kids in cages. They're, malnourished. A couple of them have died. That, like I said, that's an act of murder. And we've told grandma and grandpa, mom and dad, and I'm lucky enough where, at least my parents and my sister would tend to agree with me with most of the things I say on this podcast. A lot of people my age are, particularly those living in Nebraska, are not so lucky. The rest of my family, not so much, but we'll get to that in a moment. So, okay, Boomer, it's just like, we gave you the X amount of years, whether that be the people, whether it was like Al Gore being like, oh, hey, no, you fucking morons, climate change is real, or whether that's more recently something like just old people refusing to acknowledge the crimes against humanity that have been inflicted on our government, among particularly like minority people, but also like the just awful shit that's kind of happening in kind of South America, where we've certainly made the problem a little bit worse. The fact that all these American companies are allowed to continue to do business with China, basically by sort of the constructs of capitalism, and sort of the fact that we have not sanctioned China, basically almost required to do at least business with China if it's a business on a global scale. Obviously, if I am running a like small town restaurant in Nebraska, that's much less of a concern. But all these different things, and they're just like la la la, fake news, fake news, fake news. Well, it's only so long before we're just like, fine, like I'm just never going to engage with you. It's basically just taking the discourse and lighting it on fire. It's like, fine, like you are the enemy. And I think it ought to tie this into the other thing, which was me theorizing about what the sort of next World War III, let's call it, looks like, the next global conflict looks like. I think it's just like, well, how much longer are we going to like stay in the same society together? Like, so like we've already like just, we're not going to have discussions with each other. I don't think the OK Boomer thing is strictly generational, because I think certainly like when Ben Shapiro tweets something, if you look into his mentions now, it's a lot of OK Boomer, even though he's a pretty young guy. It's more like Boomer is more an ideology or a mentality than I should say a mentality. Mentality is better than ideology, because I don't think, like, for example, Richard Spencer, I would not say Richard Spencer the Nazi, for those who are not familiar. He's a not Nazi in the sense that like Donald Trump I call a Nazi all the time, but a Nazi isn't like, no, he literally like wears a swastika Nazi. I wouldn't call necessarily Richard Spencer's ideology that of like a boomer ideology, because it's not something that feels sort of like outdated and foolish and like completely incapable like understanding how times have changed, versus like Ben Shapiro saying like we shouldn't forgive student loans, or Ben Shapiro XY, rap is not music. That's what I would call a boomer ideology in the sense that it's just like so far fucking removed from reality. It's like you can't have a discussion with this person. But because those kind of views, whether it's like rap is not music, or easy, just pay off your student loans while ignoring the fact that like wages haven't gone up, but student loan debt has gone up. Um, that sort of thing, it certainly tends to skew heavily toward old people because just this is how society's worked since the beginning of time. At a certain point, as you get older, it's just tough to keep up, and most people at a certain age will just not understand what's going on with people of a younger age, and they'll get all uppity about it. This has been happening since the beginning of human history, so it's not fair necessarily to say that, oh, wow, old people hate young people and young people hate old people. This is a fight we've been having since, I believe it was Plato who wrote a whole piece about how like the younger generations were not like thoughtful and intellectual the way his generation was. Like so, and there are plenty of other examples throughout history. If you dig into like ancient history, right, you can find plenty of writing of older people bitching about younger people and the different worldviews that contrast. So generational conflict is certainly nothing new, but I do think within the context of really almost global history at this point, because it does seem like this sort of fascism versus socialism or right versus left. Um, there's to tie this back to the World War, what I theorized the new World War would be. Um, I think that there's certainly a divide which has been drawn heavily upon generational lines, where it's like I I think OK Boomer is kind of a sign that's like young people and old people just don't fuck with each other at all anymore. Like there's a certain respect between generations, and I think you'll still see this in like immigrant families where they've, let me try saying that but correctly, immigrant families where multiple generations households live together. I think that's one way that sort of the relationship between older and younger generations is deteriorated, because young people moving out of the house at age 18 is kind of a pretty new societal development. And when they did move out, they started a family right away. So then they had a younger generation of basically young people moving out and living on their own or living exclusively with like other young single people is an incredibly new societal phenomenon. And so this plus just demographically, it's become more where like if you look at states in the past versus states now, like most people are just not exposed to people of alternate viewpoints. Our ability to empathize with people of other backgrounds is really, I know this is almost kind of contradictory to the other point I was making about Trump, but like our ability to empathize with people with other viewpoints is deteriorated to like absolute fucking nothing. And OK Boomer is kind of a declaration. It's like, I give up. And then it also became a meme. And now it's just kind of, it's, it makes me, I guess, the OK Boomer thing, ultimately, I think I'm just going to write a blog post about this rather than talk about it for so much longer, because I just think my thoughts on OK Boomer will work better in writing. I know this is great radio content, but to me, the big thing about OK Boomer is that it is a signifier that like we have just given up on talking to people on the other side, and we're just going to keep fighting. And to tie this into 2 weeks ago when we were talking about me, like, well, this is how the next world war is going to start. I'm like, well, we're kind of past the point of no return here, and it's a public declaration, and now it is kind of just in the mainstream culture, and the mainstream culture is just accepted that like people with other backgrounds and other points of view we're never going to talk to again until and basically until society kind of hits, I don't want to say a hard reset where it's like, because that kind of basically implies that like the nukes are going to wipe us all out, which maybe they will, but at least like World War II, I think would be like almost, I would say World War II is a reset button on society, like it's a soft reset. And I think something like that is going to happen in the near future, where society's just going to, all the sort of strife that's happening, you're seeing it happening in Chile, you're seeing it happen in Argentina, you're seeing it happen in Brazil, you're seeing it happen in Venezuela, you're seeing it happen again in Syria, you're seeing it happen again in Iraq. You're starting to see it happen in France somewhat. And it's going to start happening in the U.S. I think Charlottesville was the first little drip in what I think is going to just be widespread violence, the state versus the state being, the government versus, let's just call them societally disadvantaged. And something's going to happen on a global scale and that could be basically just the damnation of our souls, where we just live in a 1984 society now where none of us have any freedoms and we are just basically slaves to like a government Borg of like white male super clones, I guess. Or we will overthrow sort of the capitalist society and replace it with something else. Maybe not necessarily something better, but something else. Yeah, and I was gonna talk. Let's just bang it out real quick. So, last time I did a solo podcast, so apparently I can talk about the Joker movie for like 2.5 hours, but although I think it's just because of the OK Boomer thing. I thought I had a lot more thoughts, and then it just got like cripplingly depressing. And also I realized like, yeah, there's a lot of overlap between like last time, and I don't want to necessarily talk about just I didn't want to necessarily bang the same 2 or 3 points on this podcast over and over again. Although, the science would say that actually would be a good way for this thing to take off. The science will also say it's not a good thing to not have your podcast on iTunes and Spotify. So good work there, Mr. Lazy. But let's just talk about Keanu Reeves' girlfriend, because I think it's lighter fare, and I have some thoughts. I don't have a ton of thoughts, but I just thought it was interesting. And this is where if Celeste is on the podcast, this would maybe be a little better. So Keanu Reeves came out and he was like walking the red carpet with his girlfriend. Neat. Okay. Well, his girlfriend is about 45 years old. That's fine. I didn't know his mid 40s. I'm sure I'm not getting the exact age right. And then Keanu Reeves is like 50 something. I think he's 55. Let's look him up real quick. But Keanu Reeves is like a 55-ish year old man. So they're fairly close in age. Nothing. Okay, I nailed it. 55. So, and his girlfriend's about a decade younger, but like what we would call in the same age group. And everyone's like, oh, Keanu, the most humble, good man in Hollywood. And I was like, oh, that's a little weird. So, a couple of things. I think that the reaction, so this is not an anti-Keanu Reeves podcast. I'm not blaming Keanu Reeves for the reaction. He just kind of, I think he's a perfectly hot take. Keanu Reeves is a pretty cool guy. But I think that it's interesting because, so the one thing it was like, so Keanu Reeves just, it's kind of known that he kind of has had a tortured life when it comes to, several close people to him. His partner, Jennifer Syme, his close friend, River Phoenix. There are a bunch of other ones. He's had a lot of people that are close to him die at like unfairly young age. So he's had a very tortured life. The other thing is, he's always been a little bit of a goofball, a little bit of kind of closeted personality, not necessarily someone who's like, necessarily like super public, other than kind of recently during the Keanu-sance, I like to call it, since the John Wick movies have come out, where he's been a little bit more on the talk shows, and some of those talk show appearances, I think, dig into it as well, where it's like, oh, this guy seems really cool. And like I said, I'm not denying that. I think Keanu Reeves seems like a pretty awesome guy. So anyways, it's kind of a known thing that like he hadn't had a significant other, at least publicly. Keanu Reeves is private enough guy that maybe he just had plenty of partners that just weren't in the public eye, which is totally fine if that's the way it is. He can do what he wants. But I thought it was really interesting that this was the first girlfriend or a partner that he had been out in public with, doing the red carpet walk with, like basically a public declaration that these two people are dating. And everyone was like, oh, this is the best thing ever. And this was not like a famous person. This isn't like, to clarify for people who have no idea what I'm talking about, this is not a thing where it's like, oh, we stand because like we love both of these celebrities and it's great they're together. But so, and everyone's like, oh, see, this is the best guy because he's not dating someone. So to tie in why people loved this, it's like, one, I think it's there is part of it that's angle, and I think that's actually really cool that everyone's like, instead of like, oh, in the cynical world where just everyone's a fucking asshole on Twitter, no, there wasn't really anyone I saw that was like, oh, look at this fucking loser. It took him 10 years to get a girlfriend. Everyone was like, oh, hey, he hasn't had a girlfriend forever. That's awesome that he found someone. Everyone's been really supportive of him, which I think is great. The thing that I think is, I don't want to say it's not great, but interesting is the age thing. And the reason that people bring up the age thing is that a lot of famous men in Hollywood, particularly men in Hollywood who have, through a combination of good genetics, being able to have the financial and time benefits to diet and exercise rigorously, having the money to afford like plastic surgery, which is a lot subtler and more effective than I think people realize, and who knows what else, probably like gene splicing and bathing in virgin blood or whatever, basically. But particularly men in Hollywood who are like 40 to 50 who have basically look a lot younger than they are. And Keanu Reeves definitely falls under that category. He does not look a day over 30, or certainly not a day over 35. There's a long history of them, and I think Leonardo DiCaprio is the one where people started noticing, because there's this famous graphic, and it came up on Reddit, came up on Twitter. It kind of just blew up, I think, probably about 6-7 months ago, where it's like every single public girlfriend that Leonardo DiCaprio has ever had since he's been famous, since the Titanic, so basically a 30-year period, has not been a day over 25. And so the graphic basically shows it's like his first two girlfriends he was together with for like 5-6 years, they turned 25, they broke up, whatever. But then it's like girlfriend was 23, got to 25, dumped him. Basically, it's like the age as soon as all these girls turned age 25, they broke up. And it was like the creepiness of it was like that it was like exactly 25. Like just Leonardo, like almost all of them were exactly 25 when they broke up. Whereas like Leonardo DiCaprio just kept getting older and older. And particularly with like one of those, like Leo had known this girl since they were 15, and they started dating when she was like 19 or 20. And that one was particularly creepy for a lot of people. But the real creepiness, I think, was just the fact that he had dated so many women. Every single one of them was 25 and younger. And as soon as the woman turned 25, he dumped them and moved on. You would think it's almost like, basically, it gives off the impression that Leo is like an age fetishist, basically. Like, he's essentially Matthew McConaughey's Dazed and Confused character, where Matthew McConaughey is like, that's the thing about the high school girls. They say the same age, I keep getting older. But like just with like people who are legal, I guess. And I think that really kind of turned particularly women the wrong way on him. But then if you dig into it, it's like, yeah, tons of guys in Hollywood are like that. It's just like Leo's the most famous one, and Leo has this weird, either coincidental or arbitrary age 25 cutoff point that looks great on a graphic that gets shared around Facebook feeds and Twitter and Reddit. So people are kind of overly excited about Keanu being an older 40 to 50-year-old male in Hollywood who could certainly date someone in their 20s or 30s if he wanted to, dating someone who not only is 45 years old, but she looks her age. and I'm not saying she's unattractive. I'm just saying like she looks like like she actually looks older than them. It's actually a little, and part of it's just the gray hair. Like, I feel kind of uncomfortable just going into great detail about a woman's appearance because it's, you dive pretty quickly into the pool of misogyny. But if you would be so kind as to give me the benefit of the doubt, if you've gotten this far in the podcast, like basically she looks her age, and a lot of it's that she has gray hair, and certainly if she's dating Keanu Reeves, she could probably afford to dye it blonde or make it. If she had a non-gray hair color, she'd probably look a little younger than 45. But like regardless, and she's not an unattractive woman. I think she's pretty attractive, but someone who definitely looks her age, and I think probably just physically looks older than Keanu. So it's just like visually, it's like, oh, see John Krasinski and Leonardo DiCaprio and Bradley Cooper. I don't remember. I did this deep dive a couple days ago in preparation for the podcast. I was like just looking up over 40 male actors who had dated women who were like 23 and younger. And it was like, oh, this list is a little discomforting. But it's like, all right, so first of all, it's like, so now I want to get into where it bothers me a little bit, but I'm also not a woman over 40 who I think they should be the ones to speak on this. So I don't want to, I'm still going to give my opinion because it's my podcast and I like to give opinions on things. And I also think after the depressing discussion that's been the first hour, we should lighten it up to end the podcast. But just keep that in mind. When I say my opinion from here on out, I say it full no welling that if there are any women over 40 who are listening to this podcast, I think I'm probably pretty safe there, but I don't want to make assumptions. I will fully cede the floor to you. I'm just saying my opinion, and I think your opinion's more valuable than mine. It's sort of like we as a society have kind of, for the most part, been like, who the fuck are you to tell me who I can date? And when we or have sex with or marry, et cetera, this is ultimately the very core of the argument that ultimately that is the core of the argument when we talk about like why gay marriage should be legal. Okay, we say, who the fuck is society to tell us who we can date? The one exception to this, rightfully so, is when it comes to basically statutory rape situations. So basically anyone over 18 dating a 16-year-old, anything along those lines. There are certain gray areas here. We as society love to pretend that there are not gray areas, and it kind of ticks me off that we do. I think pretty much anyone will agree that there is a gray area with, like, say, a older junior in high school dating a younger sophomore in high school. You could have, like, depending on when the birthdays are, you could have, like, 15 and 16-year-old becomes 17 and 15-year-old. Well, at a certain point, that's going to be a legal adult, an 18-year-old, dating a 16-year-old, or if you want to spread that a little bit, where we get a little bit dicier, maybe like a junior in high school dating a freshman in high school, which is, now we're getting into territory. It's probably a pretty little iffy, but you could have like an 18-year-old technically at some point dating a 15-and-a-half-year-old, which by the letter of the law is statutory rape. Now, regardless of your opinion on that, I certainly think that you can at the very least grant that whether like an 18 and a 15-year-old, or let's just go back to the sophomore, junior, maybe a little less dicey, an 18-year-old and a 16-year-old dating, particularly if they were both minors at the time that they started dating, or at the very least both high school students, you will certainly at the very least admit that that is completely different, entirely different quandary of moral discussion than what child pornography and statutory rape laws were written for, which is basically full-fledged adult men. Let's just call it 25 plus for now. I understand that there are 24-year-olds that are pedophiles. Let's just say full-fledged, like post-college aged adult men dating young girls in high school and middle school. Okay, that's straight up pedophilia. I don't think that example I gave. The other thing is, which is sort of the most extreme version of this, is something that's technically illegal, but is, I would say, spiritually very much in that. So the flip side, I use that example to contrast with what I think this Hollywood thing is. So that's like the polar opposite. What I think the Hollywood thing is most of the time is like child grooming is like the worst example of this. Kind of what we've seen with like all the shit that's come out with like Drake, where it's like 30-year-old has a non-sexual, basically like friendship relationship with a 16-year-old. They're sitting on the clock waiting for them to turn 18. When that individual will turn 18, all of a sudden they're having sex. Well, technically speaking, that is not pedophilia, but it is child grooming, which is very much in spirit pedophilia. And unfortunately, there's no way around it is the problem. Like, we can't just pass a law saying that like people must be within a certain age range to date each other. Okay, it's one of those things that like we as a society just have to like self-police. It's not a legally solvable problem, because ultimately the age at which someone is a sexually legal adult is arbitrary. The age of consent is kind of an arbitrary line because, as we are kids, we all develop at different rates. I was someone who developed certainly emotionally at a very slow rate. I was definitely still had like a very immature, childish outlook on the world when I was a sophomore, and there were other sophomore males who already had a very sort of adult look on the view and were starting to take the ACT and look into colleges and stuff. That's just, we develop at different rates. That's just the reality. So like a 17 or an 18-year-old in one situation may be a fully fledged adult, both emotionally, which I think is really the big issue here. Particularly when we're talking about this Hollywood dating thing, is like they are emotionally mature as an adult at 17 or 18, whereas like a 19-year-old in another situation, a lot of people are not fully physically or emotionally developed at 19. There's a whole very famous study with males that like their frontal cortex is still developing until age like 24. So it's like, so if a 22-year-old male dates a 27-year-old female, is that pedophilia? Their frontal cortex is still developing. Well, of course, no, that would be ridiculous. So the whole thing with that is that the 50-year-old still looks like 30-year-old Hollywood male actor dating the 19, particularly like when they get under 20. But like you'll see people still like really yamming on actors for dating like 22, 23-year-olds. Is that it's like, okay, well, what do they talk about? Certainly this is not some sort of like deep emotional connection. They're completely different stages of their life as far. We are constantly developing as individuals. I know, hot take. And so it is certainly not like, let's be real. It's not something, they're not going to get married. Okay. They're not going to get, probably, the odds of them getting, this is not something where they're probably dating with a plan of getting married 3 years from now. I don't think we're going to find out Leo in his 60s is not going to suddenly marry some model in her 24-year-old and have a long-lasting, healthy 20-year relationship with 2 kids. Probably. There are a couple of examples like that, but generally we can assume that is not the case. And so I think ultimately the first incredibly interesting thing I think about this is that we as a society still, when it comes to, there is a certain step, and we would call that step dating. You're not just hooking up. Like, Leo isn't just going to the club, finding a hot girl and banging them. They are like walking the red carpet together. And if you're walking the red carpet together, we as a society still think that like if you are dating someone as opposed to just hooking up with them, then society still loves the idea of you are looking for the one. They don't like the idea of this is just a thing that I'm doing for fun and then I'm going to move on. Despite the fact that we are allegedly so much more sexually liberal than we were in the 70s and 80s, people are violently opposed to this idea of just, no, I just find this person attractive and I want to have sex with them and I generally enjoy their company. So I think society, even young people, are still pretty violently opposed to the idea of people are still kind of violently opposed to the idea that like, no, I just want to have sex with them. And despite the fact that like if I bash a woman for like slinging the female equivalent of slinging the wood, I'm going to get I'm I'm going to get bashed for it and canceled, and correctly so. Women should be able to have sex with who they want to as often as they want to. But yet then we kind of apply this double standard where it's like, no, 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 but not like that. No, you have to only have, I guess, hook up with people your own age. Yet if you're in the sort of situation in your life where this is where I'm going to stand up for these Hollywood men individuals a little bit, if you're in the sort of situation in your life where you are not interested in settling down, and it's sometimes these younger people are like, no, fuck you. I'm no, they're like, no, fuck you. Once you turn 30, you have to settle down. And that's all. And then yet again, it's sort of a double standard a little bit where it's like correctly people, if you tell like a woman over 30, like, oh, you need to settle down and have kids, are going to tell you like, no, fuck off. I can do what I want. Just because I'm 30 doesn't mean I have to like settle down. By the way, that's the correct opinion. Like women who are 30 plus, if they want to sleep around like they're a frat girl, absolutely go for it. I am 100% here for it. But if you are a male and you're decide you're going to slang the wood around, you're not at a point in your life where you would like to settle down and have kids or have a long-term relationship, then you're probably, the primary way that you're judging people is on their physical appearance. And a just biological reality is that we tend to be more attracted to people who are younger. There's a whole biological basis for this. It's not really worth getting into. I don't want to get into like weirdo Jordan Peterson territory, but the biological societal reality is that people tend to find people who are younger to be more attractive. So if I'm 44-year-old, I'm 44-year-old Bradley Cooper, I'm not really looking for a situation where I want to like settle down and get married, and I see an attractive 19 or 20-year-old, and I'm rich and famous, so they probably want to hook up with me and date me, and I want to hook up with them. It's just kind of a natural reality where you're more likely to you're just more like, it's just basically how the free market of dating works, for lack of a better term, is that you're just, if you're a well-off 45-year-old male actor and you're not in a situation where you're looking for something more casual hookup oriented as opposed to, more like I'm trying to seek the one, like I'm starring in How I Met Your Mother, then the forces of those two things kind of just make it so you're probably going to be dating people that are a little bit more on the questionable side of like age of consent. And 19 is definitely different from 22, and 22 is definitely different from 25. The other thing then, so it's sort of this dicey situation where I get it, because again, if you're a 19-year-old, that doesn't necessarily mean you're fully emotionally developed, because ultimately age of consent is an arbitrary thing, And if you're a 45-year-old dating a 19-year-old, it could certainly be a situation where you're taking advantage of their emotional naivety so that you can have sex with them. But on the flip side, we also, as freedom loving, let people do what they want people, we also agree that, like, who are you to tell a man that they can't love a man? Who are you to tell a woman that she can't have random hookups in her 30s or has to settle down and have kids? So we're kind of, it's kind of a thing where, like, yeah, this is sort of icky, but at the same time, like, if there's no solution to the age of consent problem, because it's ultimately an arbitrary number, and then once you're above an arbitrary number, it's like, what are we going to do? Arrest them? And then on the flip side of it, you have the fact that, like, if you're a woman, particularly if you're a woman actor in Hollywood over the age of 35 or 40, then I can't imagine that that's good for your self-esteem. So, like, this is something I've seen a lot with where black athletes a lot of times will date or get married to white women, and white African American women are very upset about this because it's like, oh, now you're rich and famous and we're not good enough for you. And that's kind of a more well-known example, but I think certainly that is a valid thing to feel if you're a 40-year-old woman, that all of a sudden it's like, oh, so you're like, if you're a 40-year-old woman and you see, like, Bradley Cooper, I keep using Bradley Cooper because he's just the one I remember being on the list. Apologies to Bradley. I thought Star is Born is awesome. But if you are someone who, if you're someone who is, 40 years old, and you see, it's like, so are these 40-year-old men just settling for me because they're not attractive enough to get a 20-year-old? And I can't imagine that would be very good for your self-esteem, particularly if you're not married, but probably still if you're married. So there's just no easy solution. I wish we could just talk about this stuff a little bit more nuance and maybe just a little bit more, like, situationally. Like, if it's a situation like Leonardo DiCaprio where it's like, oh, this guy has this number 20. It's like, he will only date women 19 to 25, and he's been doing this for 30 years. And there is at least one situation where, like, he was family friends with this individual well before they were the age of consent. Like, yeah, that's bad. There's no other way around it. But it could also be a situation where, just like, there are people who, 25-year-olds, fall in love with 43-year-olds, and they get married and have kids and are together for 20 years. So I just wish we would treat this a little bit more situationally, I guess, would be my closing thoughts there. I did actually, we're not cracking 2 hours. Let's actually check in real quick and see what we are at. We're at an hour 42. I didn't think I'd have a lot of steam left after I was emotionally drained by the OK Boomer. Isn't that funny that I got emotionally drained by talking about a silly internet meme? But that's the sort of thing we do on this podcast. We're basically at an hour 40, and we usually at about 2 hours. I'm starting to lose my voice a little bit, so we'll call it a night. Please rate, review us once we're on platforms. Tell your friends. Like I said, no one's really listening to us right now, so odds are if you hear this, you probably know me in person. So if you like it, tell me in person. If you didn't like something, do feel free to tell me. And you all have a great morning, afternoon, evening. Obviously, we're not live, so I don't know what time it is over there. And yeah, have a good one.